up at Hog Island, so I've been involved with that pair of ospreys. I've been up in that nest a bunch of times, taking the young out to band them, and my roots go pretty deep with ospreys.
Great. We're so happy to have you here today. And we also have Scott Weidensaul on behalf of the owls and all of our owl players. Scott, you want to give a...
Sure. I'm Scott Weidensaul, formerly from Pennsylvania, now living in New Hampshire, and been an instructor at Hog Island for more than 20 years at this point, so intimately familiar with the osprey nest at Hog Island. I got hooked on raptors when I was 12 years old at Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, which is actually where I'm broadcasting from today. Started banding raptors, diurnal raptors, in the 1980s at Hawk Mountain. Got involved with owl research in the late 1990s, and since 1997 have been running a big northern Saw-Whet Owl banding and research project in Pennsylvania. We've banded something like 12,000 migratory Saw-Whet Owls in the last 25 years. And about 7 years ago, I co-founded Project Snowstorm, which has now grown into one of, if not the world's largest snowy owl research project. We're putting GPS, GSM transmitters, similar to the satellite transmitters that Rob uses. We've put them on about 90 snowy owls from the prairies of the Great Plains up into eastern Canada and New England, mostly studying their winter ecology to find out what snowy owls are doing when they're down here with us, but then also following those birds back up to the Arctic and learning more about their breeding ecology up there. So I've got a foot in both the diurnal and nocturnal world when it comes to raptors. Also have a background in raptor rehab, did a lot of raptor rehab back in the 1980s and early 90s, and had done a lot of education work with live raptors, had federal and state permits, and had a number of hawks and owls for many years that I was using for school programs and things of that sort.
So when do you sleep?
If you're an owl researcher, you don't sleep. It's also a little bit of a sleep deprivation experiment.
Well, we're going to jump right into some questions that we have from our Explore.org CAM followers and also from our Hog Island participants. But for those out there watching this on Facebook Live, feel free to drop questions in the comments and we'll see how many we can get to. But we'll start with a question about ospreys from Don. He asks, are osprey populations still increasing following their crash due to DDT and other problems, or have they saturated the landscape?
They're still increasing over most of their range. There are some areas that seem to be saturated, and there are some areas where their numbers are going down a bit, and those tend to be areas where the bald eagle numbers are going way up. So bald eagles and ospreys don't play nice. Bald eagles will love to steal food from ospreys. They will occasionally take young ospreys out of the nest. So some areas where ospreys aren't increasing, it may be linked to the increase in bald eagle populations. But overall, ospreys there are many more ospreys now than there were before the DDT crash of the late 50s and through the 60s, early 70s. In fact, ospreys now are either nesting or trying to nest in all of the lower 48 states, which 30 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. So they're spreading out everywhere. They love cell towers. They were putting up these ideal nest platforms for them. I think of cell towers as an osprey nest platform that they let us put communication equipment on. So they're doing great.
Wonderful. All right, so here's a question about owls from Cora in Tennessee. She says, what kind of predators eat owls?
Well, other owls, for one thing. In fact, the little Saw-Whet owls that I've been studying for years, they're about the size of a soda can. And their ultimate nightmare is Rob's old study subject of barred owls. Barred owls are just death on smaller owls. Great horned owls, not so much. But any owl is at risk of predation from mammalian predators during the nesting season. And here in the Northeast, where I live, as we've seen fisher populations resurge over many areas. Fishers are terrific nest predators on raptors in general, and they certainly seem to take an awful lot of raptor nests, including barred owl and great horned owl nests. Now, barred owls are nesting in cavities, so they have a little bit more protection. So do screech owls and saw-whet owls. But great horned owls, they occupy old stick nests from other raptors, ravens, crows, things like that. And so their nests are very much at risk from fishers, from raccoons, from a lot of mammalian predators.
So we have a question from Facebook. It goes back to the predation at the Hog Island Osprey camp. So this one's for you, Rob. Do you feel the increased predation at the Hog Island nest might be a rebalancing with osprey and other birds of prey recovering so well?
That's certainly the case with the situation I just described with ospreys and bald eagles. Because bald eagles have a longer generation time, it sort of took them longer to bounce back from DDT than ospreys. So ospreys sort of, as they recovered, they found this wonderful world that was pretty much free of bald eagles, which is a good thing if you're an osprey. Great horned owl populations never went down much because they're not a top order predator the way peregrines and bald eagles and ospreys are. So I don't think great horned owls were ever much affected by DDT. And what this may simply be, the Hog Island case may just be the situation where a pair of great horned owls has happened to move in and is nesting close to that particular nest. And maybe for most of the time, those ospreys were nesting more or less in peace. There just didn't happen to be a pair of great horned owls nesting nearby. And now a pair of great horned owls moved in and the property values of the neighborhood went way down.
May I comment on that as well, Eva?
Sure.
One thing about raptors, individual raptors will often start to specialize in particular prey sources. They get used to hunting particular areas for particular foods in particular ways. And an acquaintance of mine many years ago was doing her master's degree work on great horned owls in Pennsylvania. And one of the nests that we would check had a ridiculous number of woodpecker remains. And we kind of like, woodpeckers are not nocturnal. How are they getting these woodpeckers? And what we finally figured, and we can't prove this, but the speculation was that one of these two great horned owls, probably the male, had figured out how to fly up to cavities and just kind of reach inside cavities and grope around and pop a woodpecker out. Because there were also a fair number of screech owls remains at that nest, and had just learned to specialize in that. And it could be with the Hog Island nest that you've got, one or two great horned owls from this pair that found this food supply, and they were successful, and they just keep coming back. And I kind of wonder if that situation is going to continue after inevitably, one or both of those great horned owls are no longer with us. In the wild, a great horned owl has an average lifespan of like 6, 7, 8, 9 years, which is, kind of a long time if you're watching this happen every year. But, great horned owls are not common on Hog Island. I've never seen one on Hog Island. They're probably flying over from the mainland. And it'll be interesting to see if this remains a long-term issue with great horned owls. I think it's a long-term issue with bald eagles just because of the number of bald eagles. But we may see this great horned owl issue kind of disappear eventually.
Ospreys do the same thing. There's a story someone told me of a pair of ospreys up on Cayuga Lake, I think, in New York, where one male brings in water snakes, sort of a non-stop flow of water snakes is coming into this one particular osprey nest, and none of the other osprey nests nearby, the neighbors, none of them bring in water snakes. So this one male osprey just has latched onto water snakes as the favorite prey item, and the other ospreys that are hunting presumably the same areas just haven't picked up on that. So that's a really good observation, Scott.
And his mate is going, oh God, not linguine again tonight.
Well, since we're talking about what these birds eat, we have a question from Cleo in Maine. She asked, does any owl species eat fish? And if so, do they share any anatomical features with ospreys?
That's a fascinating question, Cleo. So actually, yes, there are a couple of species of owls. They're not surprisingly, they're known as fish owls. And one of them is Blankenston's fish owl, which is the biggest and heaviest owl in the world. And it's found in the Russian Far East. And there's a terrific book coming out sometime in the next couple of months by a Wildlife Conservation Society scientist who's been working with Blankiston's fish owls for years. It's called Owls of the Eastern Ice, I believe is the title. I had a chance to read it in Galley, and it's a terrific story. And what these birds do is they actually, this is way north in the Russian Far East, so kind of that part of Russia that almost touches Alaska. Really cold in the wintertime, but the rivers there they're radioactive. There's radon released into the river that keeps pockets of ice from freezing over. And so these owls are able to fish through the winter at these openings in the ice, feeding on a species of small salmon. And so this guy was, you can imagine the kind of adventure you have in that part of the really remote part of the world with Siberian tigers up there studying these huge Blankiston's fish owls. So yeah, there's a number of species of fish owls around the world that feed just on fish.
Wow. Learned something new. So Deidre on Facebook is asking, do state Osprey platforms to attract them? Is that helping the expansion?
You broke up a little in that question. Can you repeat
the question was from DJ on Facebook. She asked if states are putting up platforms specifically for ospreys. Do you know? Or is most osprey platforms done more on an individual organization level?
I don't think many states are doing it. They did early on as the osprey population was recovering from the DDT-induced crash. There was a lot of state fish and game and natural resources departments were involved in osprey relocation programs and the like. Now ospreys are no longer a species of any conservation concern. So the state knows, I don't think any states are doing anything with it, but local groups are. Actually, I think Illinois or Indiana has a reintroduction program with ospreys going on. But most of the poles and platforms that are put up by either local groups, conservation groups, or a lot of them are actually put up by electric companies because ospreys, if a pair of ospreys nests on a live platform or a transformer, the electric companies will often put up an alternate pole to get the ospreys off the hot tower so they don't blow up the transformer and kill themselves. So probably a fair number of poles that are getting put up now are being put up to get ospreys off of a trouble situation on a power line.
Great. So you mentioned that ospreys were no longer threatened. This question, Scott, from Carol asked, are there any North American species of owls that are endangered? Oh,
well, of course, the most famous there is the northern spotted owl, which is a federally listed subspecies. Spotted owls are found, there's northern and Mexican subspecies of spotted owls, Mexican spotted owls found down in the desert canyons, places like the Huachuca Mountains in southeastern Arizona. There are a number of subspecies species that are listed at state level. For example, the state of Florida, the burrowing owl population that's found in the state of Florida is listed as I'm not sure if it's a threatened or endangered species in the state of Florida, listed by the state of Florida. And even when we're talking about common species like great horned owls and eastern screech owls, the populations of both those species took a real hit in the late 1990s and early 2000s when West Nile virus came in. Certain groups of birds and particularly certain species of owls are highly susceptible to West Nile virus. And so in places like New York and Pennsylvania, where we had breeding bird atlases that were done in the 1980s and again in the early 2000s, there were significant declines in great horned owl and eastern screech owl populations in those areas, likely from West Nile virus. On the other hand, barred owls seem to be somewhat, and Rob can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but my impression is that they seem to be less susceptible to West Nile. And during those same 20-year intervals between atlases, again, in places like Pennsylvania and New York that had just redone their atlases, barred owl populations were growing dramatically in those areas. So, even widespread common species can run into problems. And great horned owl numbers in many parts of the east seem to be declining as barred owl populations are increasing, because great horned owls are more of a species of somewhat fragmented habitat. You know, they're edge species. They like a mix of fields and forests and woodlots, whereas barred owls can do really well in more contiguous forest. Although, you know, as Rob found out in his research in North Carolina, they also do very well in suburban neighborhoods.
They love the suburbs.
Well, Renee from North Carolina was actually just asking, how could I entice an owl to nest in my yard? Are there nest boxes for owls?
Oh, sure. It depends on the size depends on a little bit on your habitat, but I'm jumping in on an owl question here. But so I have a screech owl box in our backyard here in suburban Philadelphia, where weirdly enough there aren't any barred owls. But if you're in North Carolina, if you're in a neighborhood with fairly continuous large tree cover, and there are any streams nearby, just put up a box. The Audubon bird house book, I forget exactly the title, but they have my barred owl design, nest box design, which we used for many years and had lots and lots of owls using the boxes. So details on how to build those boxes and screech owl boxes are in that book, and if you put a box up, there's a good chance you'll get barred owls. If you're in suburban Charlotte, you may have to fight. The owls will be fighting over the box to get into it.
And let me just jump in there and say that if you're not in suburban Charlotte, I'd still encourage you to put up a nest box. And for smaller species like eastern and western screech owls, and if you're farther north, the northern Saw-Whet owls, the same, or even a wood duck box will work. And what's helpful, cavity nesting owls need multiple cavities in their territory. There'll be a primary nest site, a secondary nest site. Often males and females will have their own roost sites, the roost cavities. Males will often have a cavity they use as a food cache. And there's a lot of territories out there that don't have enough natural cavities. So putting up multiple nest boxes in a relatively small area is often a good way of ensuring that you're going to attract some owls, especially the smaller species. That works really well with screech owls and northern Saw-Whet owls.
How far apart should the boxes be, or how close?
I've never had anybody give me a definitive answer on that, Rob. But I know somebody who put up 4 boxes in I'm guessing like 100 by 150 foot backyard, and they got screech owls in them. And they were often during the non-breeding season. Each member of the pair was roosting during the day at the entrance of separate boxes. So they were definitely using those multiples.
I've got a new project now, build another screech owl box.
So Maria on Facebook asks, do owls in nest boxes pose a threat to bird feeders and the songbirds who come to them?
They can, actually. And, screech owls, some years ago, I used to join our local game warden in the wintertime. We'd go out and clean out wood duck boxes because the ponds were frozen. You could reach the wood duck boxes in the marshes. And I would go along with them because there were a lot of screech owls in there. And the screech owls will often cache food in the box with them. And we found a ridiculous number of cardinals. And the reason I think that they were targeting cardinals is because cardinals are often the first species at the feeder in the morning before it's fully light, and often the last one at the feeder late in the day. And I know, Rob, your barred owls in North Carolina were taking a lot of birds in the suburban areas as well. So I don't know, I'd be curious whether you were getting a lot of cardinals, but they can, but for the most part, it's not anything to worry about.
Yeah, they did. I don't think there was an inordinate number of cardinals, but there was an inordinate number of birds. Over half the prey items that the suburban owls, barred owls, brought into the nest were mostly songbirds, which was way different than the owls out in the country. And I think that's because there's an open understory, and they were catching these birds at night. They're not taking them off the feeders. They're just catching them where the birds are roosting. And there isn't most of suburban habitat is it's the barred owl's dream world. It has an open understory. They're a sit and wait predator, and they don't like young forests because the understory is so dense that you can't really see prey very well. But if you can sit up in a middle stage of the willow oaks in Charlotte and just watch all of the azalea bushes and wait for something to move in there, there's your breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
So we have a question. Maria asked, she says, ospreys often feed on fish, but do they eat other birds?
No, basically although there is one weird anecdotal story of a hawk trapper at Cape May who was flapping a lure pigeon to attract migrating raptors to his bonet or mist nets, and an osprey came in and grabbed the pigeon. But that's really unusual. Ospreys almost take nothing but fish, and most of the things that are not fish, or we're doing something like a fish, like those water snakes, or they'll occasionally catch a muskrat or a baby alligator or something like that. So they're almost strictly fish eaters.
A couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago now, the hawk counters up here in Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania got very excited because they could see an osprey coming down the ridge, clutching in its talons what was very clearly a brilliant red cardinal. And they got scopes on it, and people were grabbing their cameras so they could finally, document the first time that an osprey had taken avian prey. When they got closer, it was a brilliant red-orange koi goldfish out of somebody's backyard. It's not a cardinal.
All right, so this question is from Julia from Connecticut. She asked, do owls or ospreys lay more eggs? So which one?
Well, Rob, what's the largest number of osprey eggs that you've ever heard of?
4. So 95% of all osprey nests, or 90 to 95%, have 3 eggs. Okay. Barred owls, the clutch size is about 2. So on average, barred owls lay 2 eggs. There are a few more 1 than 3 egg clutches, but ospreys are almost always 3. Barred owls are almost always 2. And screech owls can have more, but I'm not sure about other owl species.
Well, and the owls win this one handily. Yeah, I mean, like barn owls can lay 6, 7, 8 eggs. Snowy owls can lay up to 9, and northern saw-whet owls can lay up to 13. And in fact, if you get a really good breeding year for northern saw-whet owls, their populations rise and fall based on the 4-year cycles of small mammals in the northern woods. If you have a really big year when there's lots and lots of voles in the woods, a female saw-whet owl will mate, lay 10 or 12 eggs, raise those chicks until they're half grown, abandon that family to the male, let him finish it, go off with a second male, and start a second clutch. And so years when that happens, we see these enormous surges in the saw-whet owl population in the fall when all of these juveniles, and this fall in the Northeast is going to be one of those years. You get these big surges in young owls coming down on their first migration. So owls win that one. But I should also say, if it's a year when there's very little food, the saw-whet owls or the barn owls or the snowy owls may not breed at all, or they may only lay 1 or 2 or 3 eggs. So it really depends on the food supply. There's a terrific picture that I use in my talk about snowy owls. It was from the summer of 2013 in the northern Ongava Peninsula in Quebec, where they had an historically high peak in the lemming population. And the picture is of a snowy owl nest with 4 eggs in the middle, surrounded by 78 dead lemmings and voles that the male owl had brought in before the chicks had even hatched. And what that's doing is providing a very visible sign to the female, don't stop with 4. Just keep the baby coming. There's plenty of food available. It's a way of provisioning the nest, getting the female in really good condition, and physiologically getting her to produce a lot more eggs.
And then he took off for a 2-week vacation.
Well, the thing is, when you get these really high, these tremendous high lemming peaks in the Arctic, the male owls don't have to really do very much because there's so much food. There's an example of, in fact, it's the only occasion of polygyny in snowy owls where one male had two females. And I forget the exact number, but he was hunting for himself, 2 adult females, and I think a total of 16 chicks. And he still slept 19 hours a day, because during that 5 hours that he was awake, he was able to provide enough food for all those hungry mouths, because there were so many lemmings available.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So we're going to switch gears and go back to Hog Island, get away from the Arctic, and talk a little bit about the nest, the osprey nest that we have there. So this season, our osprey nest has been having high amounts of great horned owl kind of attacks at night, scaring off our adult birds and therefore leaving the eggs to be exposed throughout the nighttime. And it looks like they are probably not going to hatch. So this is a 2-part question. Regina from Germany asks, given that it is unlikely that the osprey eggs on Hog Island will hatch, does Audubon have plans to collect the eggs? And then Sherry from Facebook asks, can dissecting the eggs from the Hog Island nest provide any information that we don't already know?
Well, let me take the first question first, and then I'll pass the other one over to Rob. And the reason I'm taking it is I'm in charge of the specimen collection at Hog Island, the skin collection and bones and eggs and everything else. Hog Island, through National Audubon, has a federal salvage and possession permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the state of Maine, that allows us to possess the skins and feathers and nests and eggs and things of these otherwise federally and state protected birds. I would very much like to collect those osprey eggs. We'd have to drill a tiny hole in each end, hold our noses because they're probably not in great shape inside, and blow out the contents. Rob, given what condition the insides of those eggs are, is there really anything that we can learn from them at this point?
No, the only thing, well, you might learn that the embryos had started to develop, and so I don't know how blowing eggs works with when you have eggs where the embryos started to develop. So the only thing that the eggs might tell us would be something about, we could do chemical analyses of the eggs to see what sort of pesticides and pollutants the ospreys are picking up. And we've done that. We've taken blood from ospreys that we've banded in the past at that nest. So we have some baseline data there. Now, there really isn't much to be learned from those eggs. We'll sort of use that as an excuse to talk a little bit about osprey eggs and their development. Osprey eggs take about a week longer to develop than you'd think for a bird of prey that size. It's about 37 or 38 days for hatching. And red-tailed hawks, which aren't that much different in size from ospreys, a little smaller, but close enough, their eggs would hatch in about 30 to 31 days. And the osprey's incubation period is closer to that of an eagle. And I'd always wondered about that in handling a lot of ospreys and female ospreys. I noticed that they have their contour feathers are very they're very short, and there's really not much downy space between the bird when it fluffs out its feathers. And the ospreys have a very poorly, if any, brood patch. So I don't think female ospreys keep their eggs very warm. So those eggs are developing rather slowly just because they're not as warm as the eggs of an eagle or a red-tailed hawk. And then on the question of how long can an egg be exposed to the elements, 3 or 4 years ago, the nest, the Explore.org nest down in the Chesapeake Bay, the female left the nest for 8 to 10 hours on a day when the eggs had already started to develop. and they were, the temperature was in the 40s, it was rainy, and the female was off the eggs for 8 to 10 hours. And I said, there's no way those eggs were going to hatch, and they did. So eggs are growing an embryo, and a bird egg is really a cold-blooded organism. They haven't developed the ability to maintain body temperature, and I think as a result, they can take chilling, and obviously if it's night after night for 8 hours, the embryos just wouldn't be able to develop in time. So they can take a lot more chilling than I'd ever imagined. But the situation on Hog Island where the adults were driven off the nest by the great horned owls night after night is clearly not a situation that the embryos are going to have enough time to develop in that egg.
So we have a question from Carrie. She asks, so given what you're describing, Rob, about the Osprey pair being kind of really attacked by these great horned owls, what's the likelihood that they will return to nest next season after kind of having this year be such a unsuccessful nesting period?
That's interesting. As a rule, most birds of prey, sort of long live birds of prey, can take it on the jaw or the lower mandible. If the nest fails, they'll come back and try again and try again. This might be a little bit more traumatic. It'll be really interesting to see what happens next year. It might have been traumatic enough that they decide to nest elsewhere, but I'd put money on them coming back and trying again next year. What do you think, Scott?
Well, you're the Osprey expert, but as you say, birds of prey are in it. They play a long game, and with a bird that's got a breeding lifespan of 10, 12, 15 or more years, they've evolved to have bad nesting seasons. And of course, the female she's a new female. That's her first experience at that nest. She doesn't know that there's a history of great horned owl attacks and bald eagle attacks at that nest. She's coming at it fresh. It's also possible that they might shift to another nest in the same territory. I mean, there's a nest site over at the boathouse and elsewhere. So yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens there. It's also possible that they may stick it out, and as I said before, the great horned owl that's been making these attacks, I would bet the farm that it's the same individual year after year. And I think when that individual's gone, it's a very open question whether there's going to be another great horned owl that's doing that. I mean, an osprey that's big prey for a great horned owl to tackle. I mean, they'll take red-tailed hawks. You said red-tails aren't that much smaller than ospreys, but it's still a pretty big bird. And it is a risky thing for a great horned owl to attack something that size at night. I mean, if the osprey gets lucky and hits the great horned owl in the face, that's it for the great horned owl. So it's going to be a very, very interesting year next year.
Well, great horned owls when people ask me what a great horned owl eats, I always say whatever it wants to. I had a friend who had a great horned owl that he was flying in falconry, and the owl was out loose in his yard, and the owl killed his male peacock, which is a lot bigger than the owl. So they're about the most ferocious avian predators there are. But you're right. I like your idea about this being a rogue owl who has sort of latched onto ospreys as a tempting food source that sometimes works out, and will be interesting to see as in the next few years what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question about great horned owls coming from Sheila Ann. Is wondering how long will owlets stay with their parents? Are they similar to ospreys?
Oh, it's a great question. So yeah, they have a long period of dependency, like young raptors of all sorts do. Of course, the thing to remember about great horned owls is they're one of the earliest nesting raptors, one of the earliest nesting birds on a year-to-year basis. I'm not sure what the egg dates are in Maine. In Pennsylvania, where I grew up, they're usually on eggs by about Valentine's Day, and usually have chicks in the nest by the beginning of March. So, bald eagles and great horned owls and ravens are like among the earliest nesting birds in the Northeast. So, and they time that so that the young are leaving the nest around the time that there's a lot of other baby animals out there, baby rabbits and baby squirrels and baby birds, so that the young owls can practice their hunting on somewhat less sophisticated and more naive prey. And over the course of the summer, the young owls will start to develop their hunting abilities. Parents don't really have to teach them to hunt, but they will be provisioning them, giving them food, and then slowly withdrawing that, so that by the end of the summer, beginning fall, getting into place like around September, the young owls are largely independent, although they may not like being independent. And once you know what the food begging cry of a great horned owl or a screech owl sounds like, you'll tend to hear that at dusk in the woods. These crybaby teenager owls whining to their parents because I haven't had anything to eat today. And, the parents by this point, their hormones are shifting. They no longer really particularly give a crap. And in fact, that's around the time of the year where they'll start actively driving their chicks out of their territory. Rob, what's the timing on barred owls? I don't know nearly as much about the annual cycle on barred owls.
They're probably at least a month later than the great horns. They're pretty much in the same schedule as the red shoulders and red tails. They're a little earlier, perhaps, but they're not like the great horns. And they have a fairly long, the young are coming out, are branching. The barred owl young branch at 3 to 4 weeks old. They leave the nest. And so that would be sort of late April, maybe the very beginning of May. And by July, they're dispersing. So they hang around maybe 2.5 months. Ospreys have a much shorter dependency period because they're migratory, and typically in New England, ospreys begin fledging sort of middle of July. The really early ones might be the second week in July, but the sort of last 2 weeks in July and the very beginning of August are when the young ospreys fledge. And as Scott said, the parents don't teach them to hunt. They just provide an allowance. They just bring fish back to the nest and drop fish off there. The young don't follow the parents out to go fishing. They'll follow each other, but they don't seem to pay attention to where the adults go. So we often hear about people talking about the young adult ospreys teaching the young to hunt. Well, there's no evidence that happens. But the young are fed as they learn to hunt, and through trial and error, and they're not good at it at first. They just go back to the nest, and Dad will be providing them with food. The female ospreys tend to leave the nesting area about the middle of August. So they're just they've been on the nest 38 days on the eggs, and then 7 or 8 weeks keeping the young dry when it's rainy, and shaded when it's hot, and warm when it's cold. And middle of August, they say, sayonara, Dad, kids, see you next year. So Dad hangs around for another couple of weeks, and again in sort of southern New England, the juveniles and the adult males are all taking off in the first 2 weeks of September. Is about when they head south. So the ospreys are getting maybe 6 to 8 weeks of training time or learning time as they get ready, and then they just head off south on their own.
So our next question is for Rob. Are ospreys more successful in saltwater or freshwater locations? And we'll also have Scott answer for the owls afterwards.
I don't know if anyone's ever, I don't know the answer to that question. I've never seen anyone address it. I know people have looked at how ospreys nesting or hunting success on windy days, cloudy days, and there's a certain sort of sweet spot. They like a little bit of wind. It makes it easier to forage, but they don't want so much wind that they're white caps so it's harder and impossible to see fish in the water. So there's some sweet spot with a little bit of wind, but not too much. Cloud cover doesn't seem to make much of a difference, which surprises me. I thought that ospreys would do better, especially hunting flounder, because if it's a sunny day and a flounder moves, you're going to see a shadow in shallow water. But the studies I've read don't seem to show any difference. So general in salt versus fresh water, I would be surprised if there's a difference. There's not. It hasn't been measured as far as I know.
And what was the question as far as owls go?
If it's more successful, are owl species more successful in saltwater or freshwater locations? So when you're looking at their range and success.
Well, I mean, owls aren't really, for the most part, are not really using any kind of marine resources. Now, I say for the most part because one of the most interesting owl populations in North America is the subspecies of northern Saw-Whet owl that's found in the Pacific Northwest on the coast of British Columbia in what has been known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. It's a non-migratory subspecies that's very dark, and they frequently forage in the intertidal zone. So like as much as 80% of their diet is marine invertebrates, which is just crazy ass when you think about it. The idea of a small forest owl of a species that normally feeds like 95% on small mammals, feeding on like amphipods and bristle worms and things like that they're finding in the intertidal zone. And in fact, there's a new study that just came out that really strongly suggests, and in fact, I think the AOS is considering a proposal to split that particular subspecies into a distinct species of Saw-Whet owl, because it's genetically distinct and certainly behaviorally distinct.
Cool.
Phil has a question about ospreys. Since they migrate, what effect does habitat loss play on their population in other countries along the way where they migrate through in winter?
It certainly can, but on the other hand, since they're fishing, so most of the North American ospreys are going down, at least from the Midwest and East Coast, are going down into Central South America for the most part, and a lot of them are in the Amazon, where there's a lot of deforestation. Well, as long as the rivers aren't messed up, and the ospreys seem to do fine. So I had one osprey, we had a satellite radio on he was from Long Island, and he went. One of the things we've learned from the satellite tracking is that ospreys are as faithful to their wintering spots as they are to their nests. So they always go back to the same spot. And this one osprey kept going back to the same spot, and there was more and more deforestation in the area. You could see that in the satellite images every year, but that didn't seem to bother him. The fish were still on the river, and as long as there was one tree left for him to perch on, well, in between fishing bouts, he was fine. So as a rule, I don't think the habitat deforestation affects ospreys much. It certainly nothing like it does for the migratory songbirds that are going down there and finding their whole habitat gone.
But Rob, if I can just jump in with a follow-up question on that? Like you said, it all comes down to fish populations. What effect do you think? Like the state of Maine has put a lot of money into restoring alewife and river herring runs on streams and ponds, places like Damariscotta Mills, which was a local effort, not all that far from Hog Island, where they've got now millions of alewives running up into Damariscotta Pond and providing food for ospreys. Is that making a difference for coastal populations?
I don't think we have enough data to answer that, but it certainly I suspect it does, because the ospreys they really rely on those herring and alewife runs in the spring, and then the menhaden arriving. There's good news that we may be actually moving toward a more reasonable management of the menhaden fishery than we've had in the past. So that may be a good sign for ospreys. So all of that work on restoring the runs that are for herring and alewives is good news for ospreys.
Thanks.
So we have a question from the chat that says, what laws protect owls and ospreys, and do you believe they're being enforced sufficiently?
I'm happy to take that one, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately and doing some. Ospreys, native birds in general, are protected at the federal level primarily under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was passed by Congress in 1918. That's the foundational law that protects all wild birds. If I go out and shoot a robin or I go out and shoot a red-tailed hawk, I'm going to be prosecuted under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. When the BP oil spill occurred 10 years ago and an estimated 1 million birds died in that oil spill, BP was fined $100 million under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that money had to go toward restoring and mitigating bird populations. To celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 2018, the Trump administration gutted the law. They announced a new interpretation of the law that said, unless you intended to kill a migratory bird, killing it is not a violation of the law. So in other words, because BP did not blow up an oil well intending to kill a million birds, it's not in violation of the Migratory Bird Act, and therefore it would be off the hook for $100 million in fines. The administration is racing to codify that regulatory change even as we speak, because if it's codified, it will be much harder for a subsequent administration to change it. Audubon has been fighting this tooth and nail. There is a bill that was introduced last year in the House of Representatives that was voted out of committee in January, called the Migratory Bird Protection Act, which would restore that enforcement power. It's not that the Fish and Wildlife Service was prosecuting a lot of people for what's known as incidental take, where people were inadvertently killing wild birds. You cut down a tree and it's got a robin's nest in it. The Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't going to show up at your house and arrest you. What they were doing was using the Migratory Bird Act and the enforcement powers to convince industry to take proactive steps. Rob mentioned utility companies putting up poles to get ospreys off hot poles and onto nest platforms. Utility companies across the West in particular have spent a lot of money over the years retrofitting their electrical transmission lines to make it less likely that they're going to electrocute eagles and ospreys and large raptors. I mean, snowy owls get electrocuted quite a bit because they could be prosecuted theoretically under the Migratory Bird Act if they did not take action to prevent this. It's been a great way to incentivize industry to take steps to protect wild birds. And unfortunately, the Trump administration has really eviscerated that law. End of soapbox.
Well, there in the comments section, there is a link to one of our action items at Audubon, so you can voice your opinions on that, and you can check that out in the comment section.
And let me just say that I believe the comment period on this change is open through July 20th, so just a couple of weeks left. The last time I checked, there had been something like 50,000 comments made, almost universally against the change. Every comment helps.
Yes, so Audubon has set up a way for you to easily voice your comments on this action item. So definitely check that out in the comments section of this video. So with that, it seems like our hour here is coming to a close.
Time flies when you're having fun.
So much information about owls, ospreys, and all things in between. I think that's a good stopping point with an action item that we can all take when we get off of this video. But I really want to take this time to thank Rob and Scott for their time and their expertise. If you would like to learn more from both of them, they're instructors at our Raptor Rapture program that is currently found on our website. That's hogisland.audubon.org. I'll drop that in the comments section as well if you want to keep learning from these two wonderful instructors. They have multiple lectures on all things raptors, ospreys, owls, and otherwise. So you should definitely check that out. And then, of course, both of them are instructors at Hog Island Audubon Camp in Maine. And they have different sessions that you should come and see them in person at Hog Island, because this discussion happens at the dinner table at night, the lectures and the field trips. So there's lots of times to keep asking your questions of both of them. But thank you both for joining us today.